So hello everyone. So today we are going to discuss the first question on polity. So the question reads as follows. Misuse of Article 356 has a long past and it has not reduced even after the landmark S.R. Bommai judgment. Discuss with special focus on the consequences it had on our federalist setup. So the question has different parts or different dimensions. So I'll break it one by one. So at first it says the question is on Article 356 and its misuse. Okay, so that is very clear. So we have to mention that what is the context of Article 356 or why it exists in the Constitution. Then you could say about how it has been misused in the past. Then you could go on to say how a Bommai judgment came in and how it tried to prevent the misuse of Article 356. Then you have to say how even after S.R. Bommai judgment, how still misuse of Article 356 continues, and maybe give one or two reasons for it. So this is up till here is the run up to the crux of the answer. Okay, then you start discussing the consequences the misuse of Article 356 have on our federalist setup. So that is a major crux. That is where all your major points should come in. So once you say or you list out the consequences on our federal setup with enough concurrent or current examples, then you would have to give some solutions to it, right? So in UPSC, you are never expected to complete an answer by stating a problem. Okay, so all the consequences on the federal setup due to misuse of Article 356 are going to be negative consequences. So basically we are stating the problem we have. So once you state that, you give some solutions as to how we can improve the scenario. Maybe if you have some committee recommendations, which here we do have, you suggest those recommendations. It need not be your own solutions. You can give out the suggestions given by expert committees, and then you can, as a conclusion, you could say that how when those recommendations are properly implemented, how the misuse would be prevented or misuse would be ended forever, and how it would signal a new era for federalism in this country, right? So that is the overall tone of the answer you should take, and that is the overall idea that you should be understanding from the question. So now we move to how we structure, okay? So the question is about discussing, so you know you have to do that freewheeling kind of a thing. You bring in different arguments that are both explicit and implicit in the question. So first you can start by, intro could be about defining Article 356, and you could say how Article 356, the actual reality of Article 356, right? So that is the misuse, how misuse of Article 356 has happened. That is something you can mention together with your introduction. Once you move to the body, first you have to maybe devote 2 sentences to enlist the historical context of Article 356. So how it has been misused in the past up till S.R. Bommai, right? So that's what we are saying, even though it has been misused in the past. So that part is that you have to give a response to that part. So that is the historical context of misuse of Article 356 until S.R. Bommai. So then S.R. Bommai comes in. It gives out concrete steps to prevent misuse. You list that, a few of them, not all of them. There are so many points there. You just have to list down some of the important points. So there would be S.R. Bommai citing both proper use of 356 and improper use. So those are the points you have to mention. So up till here, like I said, is the run up to the answer. Then you go on to discuss the consequences this have on our federalism. Okay, so you explain it in 4 or 5 points. You give examples, enough examples there. So once you have enlisted or listed out or explained these negative consequences, you give out some solutions to improve improve the scenario. So obviously you have to bring in committee recommendations. Then finally would be your projection of a scenario or your projection of a world where there is no center-state conflict due to misuse of Article 356. That is the ideal scenario. So how that is good for that is essential for the larger good. So you should be in a position to indicate to that. So that is the final goal we need to achieve by stopping misuse of Article 356. So this is the overall structure you need to have for this answer. So once you mention, so see at each part, what we need is not a volume in each subsection, okay? You just need to mention all these subsections in a coherent manner. That is the only idea that I'm looking at. Okay, once you mention all these parts, it clearly shows you have responded to every argument, every demand of the question, both implicit and explicit demand of the question. Okay, so now we go to the actual content of the answer. So we move to the actual answer. So like I said, the introduction can be about the Article 356 itself. So it states that if the president, upon report of the governor, feels that the government of a state cannot be carried on in accordance with the provisions of the Constitution, Article 356 or president's rule can be applied there. So that is what the article states. So you have to then write that it was an emergency power, right? So an emergency power which Dr. B.R. Ambedkar hoped that would remain a dead letter has led to overthrow of perfectly legitimate governments in the past, okay? Or you could say that it has been misused to remove perfectly legitimate state governments that have been fired, either to make them fall in line with the central government's argument, or for the union government's party to form a government in the state. So for either of these reasons, many perfectly legitimate state governments have been overthrown by misusing Article 356. So these are two things that could be part of your introduction. Okay, so that is about your introduction. So then we move to the body, like where we said we will discuss the historical past. So like I said, it has to be a minimal thing. So you could say that the Sarkaria Commission says that since independence, over 100 instances of president's rule has happened. So Sarkaria Commission happened way back in 1970s. So now if you look at, it's around 125 to 130. That is a kind of number. So you could say that starting from the first misuse of Article 356 by Jawaharlal Nehru himself by overthrowing the communist government in Kerala on a false pretext, then it reached a totally different height. The misuse of Article 356 reached a totally different height during the regime of Indira Gandhi, which included emergency, and the next regime of Morarji Desai. So just a fact, during Indira Gandhi's time, in the first regime, 1966 to 77, she imposed president's rule for almost 35 times. And we don't expect that to be true, right? So that is the thing. After all this random case where again a president's rule situation came out in S.R. Bommai in Karnataka. So that was the name of a Karnataka chief minister. So in the S.R. Bommai case, the Supreme Court took up the matter seriously. They wanted to put an end to this scope of misuse that was there in Article 356. Okay. So you can briefly mention this, the gist of what I have said as the body part. Then you could say about S.R. Bommai. So S.R. Bommai clearly laid down two major principles. One thing is that the confidence of the the confidence of legislature in the government has to be decided by a floor test, or in other words, S.R. Bommai made the floor test mandatory to determine the fate of the House, fate of the government. And secondly, if the governor, every time the president's rule is declared based on the advice of the governor, so the advice of the governor has to be based on a relevant material. So if there is no relevant material that suggests for dissolution of a state assembly or state government, actually the Supreme Court can reinstate or can negate the action by the central government. So these are two major principles which S.R. Bommai has laid down when it comes to bringing more objectivity into misuse of Article 356. Then you can also mention, it also laid out examples of proper and improper use of the article. So maybe you could give two examples in both cases. For proper use of Article 356 can be, the proper use, one example of a proper use would be when after general elections to assembly, no party gets a majority. So the scenario of a hung assembly. So when there is a hung assembly scenario, the governor can recommend for president's rule. Otherwise, when a constitutional direction by the central government is rejected, the governor can declare recommend for president's rule. Or if there is an internal subversion that the state government is actively or deliberately acting against the constitution and the law of the land and is trying to foment a revolt. Okay, so that is all. These are all situations where a proper use of S.R. Bommai is possible. Then you can mention one or two examples of improper use of S.R. Bommai. So it states that if the governor himself satisfies that the legislature doesn't have confidence in the government, that becomes an improper use. So the governor's confidence in the executive can only be based on a floor test. Governor cannot have a personal confidence in the matter. He cannot have a personal say in the matter. So that becomes an improper use. Then a dismissal of state governments on petty charges like maladministration, occurrence of corruption and things like that. Those are also improper use. So overall, S.R. Bommai brought in much structure to the scene. So that is more than enough. Then you could say that, so this kind of reduced the instances of S.R. Bommai, but recent examples of improper use of misuse of Article 356 in Arunachal Pradesh, Karnataka, etc. amply shows that it still continues. And the reason for the continuation of misuse could be attributed to political reasons that would always remain. The other is the partisan role of the governor. So just to give you a context, that's not part of the answer. So the appointment and removal of governor is done by the central government, and it's just a political process. There is no sense of objectivity in that process. So the governor is always at the whim and fancy of the central government, or at the pleasure of the president, as we call it. So the governor always acts as an agent of the center in the state. So he or she often plays politics, and they unnecessarily or unwarrantedly recommend for imposition of president's rule. So that is a thing we are mentioning here. So that is why even after S.R. Bommai, still this continues. Now you go to the crux of the answer, where we start mentioning the consequences this have on our federalist setup. So now we move to the major part of the question. So it is here you have to focus or give out your best points. So the consequences on federal setup. So first of all, it would lead to increased tensions between center and state, right? So increased hostilities between central and state governments. So when you're writing these kind of points, right, you have to write the gist of the point or the major crux of the point in the beginning, and then maybe you can explain what it is. But don't write the entire explanation and create a scenario where I have to look for points, right? So just write straight away the crux of the question, what happens or the consequences of it on federal setup. So straight away say it increases the hostilities between center and state. Secondly, it undermines the legitimacy of the state government. So legitimacy of state governments get undermined. Once you write that, you can explain how that happens, because that also has to be there. Okay, how it undermines, how misuse of Article 356 undermines the legitimacy of state governments. So once they start misusing this Article 356, it could happen anytime, right? It's just on the whim of the central government. So, and the state governments which which would have won elections by a huge margin, and they have formed the government, but the central government just with a stroke of pen would overthrow the state government. So it means that there would be an erosion of legitimacy of the state government in the eyes of the common public. So just for example, what you can consider is the case in Jammu and Kashmir. So they have after a long time, they actively participated in the democratic process of elections, and they elected a government. But very quickly, the central government doesn't think twice before dismissing a Jammu Kashmir state government. So how will the citizens of that place or the people of that place think about the legitimacy of state governments, right? So they would know that, okay, central is all powerful. They could do anything with the state governments, and thus it erodes the legitimacy of the state government. So that is a bad consequence for federalism, right? So a significant federal unit of the constitution is their legitimacy is getting eroded by misuse. Then another thing is that it prevents the emergence of a mature federalism. So a mature federalism is one in which there is a proper acknowledgement of the fact that both the central and the state governments derive their power from constitution, and there is no hierarchical relationship between center and state. So that is the actual federal setup that we have envisaged. Okay, even though we have a federalism with a unitary bias, but both of them derive power from the same constitution. It is not that the state governments derive power from the center. Okay, so that is how hierarchies exist, but that is not the system we have. We have both gaining power from the same constitution. So when this frequent misuse of Article 356 happens, the federalism would never evolve to that mature phenomena. Then the fourth important point is that what do you call it? It leads to it severely curtails developmental and welfare activities in the affected state. So once you write this point, you could explain it. So you just structure all these points in a 2-sentence format. First you write the main point, then you explain it in a sentence. So both in 2 simple sentences. So how it curtails the development and welfare activities? So when president's rule is declared in a state, it is run by the governor or by some agent of the state. So they would be interested in maintaining a minimal state, right? Because they are remotely controlling it from somewhere else. So they would just look at the day-to-day administrative affairs. They would never focus on the much difficult to handle developmental and welfare activities, which is more important for the public of that or the people of that state. So basically, Article 356, misuse of Article 356 have a severe consequence on public welfare. So that is another major point. Another thing is that it prevents emergence of state leadership. Prevents emergence of state leadership. So how that happens? So if you want to understand this properly, you have to understand the scenario of president's rule in an earlier time. So even in 60s and 70s, some state governments have been suspended for over 12 to 14 years or so. I think that is the exact scenario. It happened in Bihar. So just imagine, for 12 years, there is no state government. So who would come to politics, right? So they know that in these times, there is no, if you are a power-hungry person, which all of the politicians largely are, you would never want to join the politics because there is no scope for you to work in politics because in that state, because every affair of that state is done by the central government, right? So it prevents emergence of local leadership. It prevents proper democracy from functioning. So that is a very crucial point. So I think, yeah, that is it. These are some of the major points. What are the consequences this misuse of Article 356 has on the federal setup? So overall, the state government would be undermined. The public there would be severely affected. It prevents emergence of proper political system in the state, proper maturing of the federalism. And another important thing is that, yeah, the fear of fear of president's rule would prevent the state government from claiming their federal rights, resources, and their responsibilities. So when the central government start imposing president's rule in a state without any dime or reason, so the state governments would always be in the fear of that, right? For example, just to give an example, so ever since the particular state government in Kerala came in, this communist state government in Kerala came in, there had always been a saying or apprehension that the BJP government in the center would impose president's rule, because this the communist BJP conflict was so much fuming. So it was just an apprehension by the public. But see, that is the kind of situation the state governments would be in. There would be that, like the Damocles sword that hangs over your head, that fear would always be there. So it could, I don't know about the Kerala state, but there could be situations where the state governments would cover in that fear. They would just take a more subordinate position to the central government, and they would be fearful to claim their due rights, the resources which they have to legitimately get from the central governments, or the responsibilities to perform or to act in the state. So all of those things would be affected due to misuse of Article 356. Okay, so I think these are the major consequences that we would have on our federal setup. So the conclusion could also be part of the solution. So when you are concluding, you have to, what are the solutions to this scenario? So whatever be the solution you take, so as long as the politicians don't mend their ways, this could always happen. So that is always there. So you could say that SR Bommai has to be implemented, or the principles of SR Bommai or the spirit of SR Bommai has to be preserved intact in this country for this to stop happening. Another thing is that the partisan role of the governors has to be corrected by making the appointment and removal procedure of governors more objective, just like the Punji Commission has recommended. The Punji Commission has recommended to make the appointment and removal of governors into a more rigorous process. They don't want just him or her to be appointed and removed just at the pleasure of the president like this. They wanted to have an objective criteria put in place. They don't want to bring current politicians, they don't want to give that post to the current politicians and things like that. So you could just mention that the partisan role of governor has to be put an end by implementing the recommendations of the Punji Commission in that matter. So I think that should be enough as the solution. Then you could give a final concluding statement. You could say that once this spirit of federalism is duly appreciated in this country, we can have a better harmony and a better complementarity between central and state governments, which is very crucial for Indian state, for the state and the country to become powerful drivers of progress in this country. That is one way you can say it. Or if you want, what do you call? So if you want this country to take off, if you want to end the poverty in this country, if you want to make 21st century an Indian century, it is essential that the center and state collaborate. So any points of conflict and confrontation that exist them would have to be removed if such an ideal scenario is to be created. I think that could be that in some of those lines you could give a concluding statement and end the answer. Okay, so this is it. This is the major chunk of the answer, the crux of the answer, but your answer should not be having only this part. You have to logically build your answer up till there based on the structure given in the question. Okay, so I hope you're clear with this explanation. Thank you.